This is ALHS 1011. This is the nervous system chapter. It is divided into two parts. The nervous system, talking about the central and peripheral nervous system. And then the second part will be the nervous system talking about senses. So this is the first part, part one. Go ahead and start. These are your learning objectives as found in your syllabus. Okay. So the nervous system, essentially, if we had to explain it very, very, very simply, it is an electrical messenger system, and the body, the endocrine system is also a messenger system, but the endocrine system uses hormones or chemicals as its messenger, whereas the nervous system uses electrical impulses. And both systems use input from the sensory system. So our senses will give us information about the environment, and then our nervous system and or endocrine system will act. This system is 24/7, 365, and it is monitoring our conditions, taking corrective action when necessary to keep everything running smoothly. And what that means is maintaining homeostasis or internal balance. Okay, so we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And we'll start with the central nervous system, or the CNS. And essentially, the central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. Breaking that down further, the brain has its own components. It's got the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brain stem, and the cerebellum. And we'll kind of dissect each component. So as I mentioned, the nervous system is comprised of the central nervous system, which we said just a second ago was the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, that's everything outside the brain and spinal cord, all the nerve and nerve tissue outside of the brain and spinal cord would be considered the PS, or peripheral nervous system. And both the CNS and the PNS connect at the spinal cord. And that's how they come together. So we have, and this slide is a little bit blurry, the graphic. We have input, as I mentioned, sensory input. And when we're talking about input, we're talking about afferent. We're talking about output, we're going to respond in a motor or muscular way, or efferent. So input comes in from the peripheral nervous system. So let's say our fingertips, via the sensory system, like tactile nervous tissue. The output side is the motor system, is our reaction. Okay, I like this graphic because it kind of breaks it down even further. So we start with the nervous system as a subject. We have the CNS and the PNS, and we discussed the CNS is the spinal cord and brain. The peripheral nervous system is made up of two. So that goes into the somatic nervous system. Somatic, soma means body, and the autonomic. Okay. I always think of autonomic almost as automatic, and that system can be broken down into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And we'll talk about that in detail later. So you have the somatic nervous system, which controls our muscle, and it's mostly, remember I said it was body. So it's mostly voluntary movements, okay? It's what we consciously think to do, okay? The autonomic is much more involuntary, and it has to do, it engages, rather than our skeletal muscle, it engages our cardiac and smooth muscle and is mostly involuntary. Here's another graphic kind of saying this. we've got our nervous system up top, the CNS, which is your brain and spinal cord, and your PNS, the peripheral, everything else outside of the brain and spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system gives us sensory input. So that will tell our brain and spinal cord what's going on in the outside. Then the brain and spinal cord will respond with a motor response. Under the peripheral, we have the somatic or skeletal voluntary muscles, and we have the autonomic, which is the automatic, which is more of our smooth and cardiac muscles. And that can be further divided into parasympathetic and sympathetic. Here's an overview.
The function of the system is to provide rapid communication and integration between various organs, as well as with the outside environment. It detects changes within the body and in its surroundings, and responds accordingly. Fast communication is achieved by means of electrical signals known as nerve impulses, which are generated and carried by specialized cells, called neurons. The major components of the nervous system are the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. The brain, enclosed and protected in the cranium, is the central processing center. It receives information, makes decision, and coordinates the body's response. The spinal cord, enclosed in the spinal column, functions as a communication gateway between the brain and the trunk and limbs. Nerves are cord-like structures that conduct information, similar to electricity conducting wires. They are composed of axons of neurons, the cell bodies of which are clustered in knot-like structures called ganglia. Ganglia commonly serve as relay centers, where neurons synapse and transmit information to each other. The brain and spinal cord make up the central nervous system, while nerves and ganglia constitute the peripheral nervous system. Functionally, a nerve fiber can be sensory or motor. Sensory nerve fibers carry sensory information from sensory receptors to the central nervous system, while motor nerves conduct motor instructions from the central nervous system to effector organs, the muscles and glands. Nerves that contain both sensory and motor fibers are known as mixed nerves. There are two major groups of nerves, cranial nerves and spinal nerves. The 12 pairs of cranial nerves emerge from the base of the brain and relay information between the brain and the head and neck regions. The cranial nerve 10, named vagus nerve, also communicates with internal organs. The 31 pairs of spinal nerves arise from segments of the spinal cord and innervate the trunk and limbs. Spinal nerves communicate with the brain via the spinal cord. All spinal nerves are mixed nerves. They contain both sensory and motor fibers. Typically, sensory receptors send impulses by way of sensory fibers in spinal nerves to the spinal cord, which relays the information up to the brain. The brain interprets the information and sends back instructions down the spinal cord to motor fibers in spinal nerves to reach effector organs. The peripheral nervous system can be divided into somatic and visceral subdivisions. The somatic nervous system includes sensory nerves from the skin, muscles, bones, and joints, and motor nerves that innervate skeletal muscles. This system controls voluntary muscular contractions, as well as involuntary somatic reflexes. The visceral nervous system, on the other hand, includes sensory division that detects changes in the viscera, the organs in the thoracic and abdominal cavities, and motor division that controls cardiac muscle, smooth muscle of internal organs and glands. It produces, for example, faster heart rate and breathing rate during physical exercise, and slower cardiorespiratory rate during sleep. The visceral motor division is also known as the autonomic nervous system because it's largely autonomous, acting independently of the body's consciousness and voluntary control.
Okay, we're going to get into detail of some of that, but I thought that was a good overview of the organization of the system. Okay, moving right along, we have discussed a little bit about nervous system tissue in the tissue chapter. nervous system tissue, the nervous system does not have any kind of epithelial, connective, or muscle tissue. So those were the first three types of tissues. It has its own specialized nervous system tissue. And within nervous system tissue, we have two types. We have neuroglia and neurons. So what you see here is three neurons, three main neurons, and you have glia. Glia are the other cells that are kind of accessory or supplementary to the neurons themselves. And glia means glue. So think of it as neurons and their glue. Okay, neurons, as we know, send, receive, and process information. Each part of the neuron has its own specific function. And we were introduced to the neuron in the muscular chapter under the neuromuscular junction. So here are the parts of a neuron. We have the cell body, which is the main part of the cell, and that's responsible for cell metabolism, protein synthesis. We have dendrites, which receive information from the environment. So the dendrites are kind of like the feelers, and they are highly branched, and they're receiving information from the environment. Then you have the axon, it's the long tail thing. The axon, with its axon terminals, the ends, is where a neuromuscular junction happens. But the axon is the long tail-like thing that generates and sends signals to other cells. So think of the dendrites as bringing in information, and the axon is going to send information out. The little branches, the ends of the axon, are axon terminals. So at a synapse is where the axon terminal and another cell meet. Usually there's a space. On the axon itself are myelin sheath. Myelin is made of lipid or fat, and it covers or insulates the axon. This is not a continuous covering. There's breaks in the myelin, which are called the nodes of Ranvier. The gaps, those breaks in the myelin, are again where the axon is exposed, or are the nodes of Ranvier. So the myelin has, it almost has little chunks of it on the axon, and that will become important, the nodes of Ranvier, when we understand how an electrical impulse moves down the axon. So here is the neuron, the cell body, the dendrites bringing in information, the axon, and then the terminal. And then what's not being shown here is the myelin in little space, and the space is called the nodes of Ranvier. Neurons can be classified on how they're structured. So if we have a bipolar neuron, it has one axon and one dendrite. So it's got sensory parts. It's got one for input and one for output, basically. If there is a unipolar process, this is in the middle picture, it has one process split into two projections, okay? And then a multipolar neuron, as we see in the brain and spinal cord, has many processes, usually one axon and many dendrites coming off its cell body, okay? We also can classify neurons based off what they do. So mentioned before that afferent means coming in, or a sensory input from the environment. So some neurons are purely sensory. They're monitoring input from the environment. Okay, this example of the sensory neuron here would be unipolar. Then we have motor neurons, which are efferent, as in the last example. Okay, and that neuron interacts with muscle, and so its main function is output or efferent. And then interneurons are kind of communicators between. We also can call those association neurons. So that was the first type of nervous system tissue. The second type is neuroglial or glial, and those are specialized cells in the nervous system that support neurons. So they're support cells. And in the peripheral nervous system, we have two types: Schwann cells and satellite cells. Schwann cells make the myelin, and you can see the myelin in its chunks on this axon real well. So it'll make that myelin for the peripheral nervous system. Our satellite cells, shown in purple, kind of glops all over that cell body. Those are support cells, and those control the environment. The central nervous system, so what I mentioned previously, Schwann and satellite were part of the peripheral nervous system, Schwann and satellite. In the central nervous system, we've got 4 different types of glial tissue. We have astrocytes, microglia, ependymal cells, and oligodendrocytes. So astrocytes, let's see, look like stars. Astro kind of look like stars. And they form the blood-brain barrier in the central nervous system. So that's the type of glue they are. Our microglia remove debris and fight off pathogens. Ependymal cells they're almost like, it sounds like epithelial, so similar. It covers and lines the cavities, and it produces cerebral spinal fluid. And lastly, our oligodendrites form myelin. Wait, that sounds familiar. In the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells make myelin. In the central nervous system, oligodendrocytes make myelin. Okay? So here's another kind of cool picture. We have, this is in the leftmost side, this is the central nervous system looking at its glial cells. We've got astrocytes supporting. We've got microglia removing debris. We've got oligodendrocytes making myelin. Ependymal cells lining the cavity, making that CSF. In the peripheral, we've got Schwann cells producing myelin and satellite cells supporting cells. Okay. The CNS, as we mentioned, is the brain and spinal cord. The brain is located at the top of the spinal cord. It begins at the foramen magnum. The brain fills the skull. Okay. There's a cadaver picture below. You have the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem are the main sections of the brain. Okay. Here's a little information about the brain.
The brain is the most complex organ in the human body. As part of the nervous system, the brain coordinates all of the body's functions. In adult humans, the brain is a 3-pound gelatinous mass of fat and protein. It's comprised of 4 main regions: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the diencephalon, and each one controls specific tasks. The largest section is the cerebrum, and it makes up over 3/4 of the brain's volume. It consists of neurons and nerve fibers that transmit information from the neurons throughout the brain and body. The cerebrum controls higher functions such as learning, reasoning, and speech, plus senses like sight and hearing. Under the cerebrum is the second largest part of the brain, the cerebellum.
Much like the cerebrum, the cerebellum has nerve cells and nerve fibers. It carries signals to other parts of the brain and the spinal cord. The cerebellum is responsible for coordinating muscle movements, particularly those that help maintain the body's balance and posture. The third region, the brainstem, lies in front of the cerebellum and anchors the brain to the spinal cord. The brainstem is a collection of structures that include the pons, a mass of nerve fibers that carry sensory information, the midbrain, a region of fibers and structures that help control movement, along with auditory and visual processing, and the medulla oblongata, which creates motor and sensory pathways between the midbrain, the pons, and the spinal cord. Altogether, the parts of the brainstem control vital bodily functions such as cardiac activity, respiration, digestion, and sleep. The fourth region is located above the brainstem and makes up the core of the brain, the diencephalon. About the size of an apricot, the diencephalon is a grouping of several structures. The thalamus, which processes and transmits information from all senses except smell, and the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, which work together to produce and regulate neurochemicals. These structures help govern sensations, weight regulation, energy, and instinctual behaviors, such as eating, drinking, and having sex. The brain's four main components, the diencephalon, brainstem, cerebellum, and cerebrum, work in sync to ensure bodily functions are fully operational. The brain has even evolved mechanisms to protect itself. One such mechanism is the blood-brain barrier, a semi-permeable cellular wall that only allows specific chemicals to enter from the body's bloodstream into the brain. Despite this protection, tumors and other complications can lead to life-threatening problems and diseases in the brain, such as dementia. Thankfully, scientists have found ways to improve brain health. Staying physically active and eating a balanced diet may preserve cognitive function and even reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's. So while the brain only makes up a small percentage of the body, it plays a crucial role in the body's functions and overall well-being.
Okay, so I thought that was a good overview. Okay, so now we know the four main sections of the brain. Now let's look internally. When we look internally, and this would be a transverse section of the brain, we have white matter and gray matter. The white matter is myelin, and think that white is fatty, okay? The gray matter is the cell bodies of the neurons, making it gray. And then we have some hollow cavities, okay? It is the opposite of the spinal cord, where the white matter is an internal and the gray matter is external, the cell bodies on the outside. So the spinal cord is the opposite. We have nuclei in the brain that are deep islands of gray matter surrounded by white. So you can see that here you have some islands. We call those nuclei. Then we have the cerebral or cerebellar cortex, and that is a layer of gray matter surrounding white. So that is the gray matter surrounding white is the cortex or the outside. And here's a better picture of it. So this is a transverse cut. We have some fissures, the corpus callosum in the center. We'll talk about that in a second. We have ventricles, which we'll learn about. Sulci or sulcus are kind of grooves or indentations. We have white matter made up of myelin, and we have gray matter made up of cell bodies. And the surrounding gray matter is called the cerebral cortex. Okay. Outside of the cerebral cortex, we have protective covering, similar to any other membrane in the body. It acts as cushioning, it has fluid, and it has layering, which provides that shock absorption. So the layers of it, we have the cerebrum right here, the outside, right? You've got a blood vessel, okay? And then you've got different layers. So the dura mater is so you have between the meninges exists between the skull, the cranium, and the brain itself. And going from the skull inward, you have the dura mater. So the dura mater is the outer layer. It's thicker. It's next to the bone. Okay. So it's thicker. It's fibrous. It's next to the bone. The next layer is arachnoid, which arachnoid sounds like arachnophobia or something. It's resembling a spider web. So it's wispy, it's delicate, it's like a spider web, and it's collagen and elastic fibers, and that produces the shock absorption, and transportation also happens there. The pia mater is the inmost layer. That's next to and fused to the brain. It has blood vessels, the pia mater, that serve to feed brain and spinal cord. So as I mentioned, there's fluid in these spaces. So they have three membranes, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And then the spaces contain fluid, cerebral spinal fluid. And this is a strong protective system. Otherwise, every time you bumped your head, you'd be hitting brain against bone. So this protects us against hitting brain against bone. I mentioned the spaces. So we have, so here's a more in detail picture. So we have the CNS or the brain, let's say the brain or spinal cord, right? Then we have the subarachnoid space. So we have a subarachnoid space, sub meaning below, the arachnoid space. Remember, the arachnoid layer is that wispy, spider-like. So it's between that arachnoid mater and the pia mater, there's a space. And this is a large space filled with CSF, or cerebral spinal fluid. The next space up toward the skull is called the subdural space. And that's between the dura mater and the arachnoid matter, and it's filled with a smaller amount of fluid. There's less space there for fluid. And then between the dura mater, that thick fibrous, and the bone of the skull, we have the epidural space. And that is a space that's filled with fat and blood vessels. And it's the outermost space that could be filled with fluid. So we've got the skull, we've got the dura mater next to the skull, the arachnoid mater, some vessels, right? We have the pia mater, and then we have the brain itself. So we have lots of layers of spaces and tissue before we get from skull to brain. And I mentioned that CSF, that cerebral spinal fluid. So that fluid is made in the ventricles of the brain, which we'll talk about in a second, by the choroid plexus. It's almost like amniotic fluid for the brain. It provides buoyancy. The brain can float in this cavity. It's protection against impact. That fluid protects brain. It's not brain against bone because there's some fluid there. It nourishes the central nervous system, brings it some glucose, and it also removes some waste from the brain and spinal cord. Okay, I mentioned the ventricles. And the ventricles are essentially cavities, 4 of them. Cavities in the brain that are lined with epidermal cells. Epidermal cells remember, they line cavities and they're filled with cerebral spinal fluid. We have 1 and 2 are in the cerebrum, 3 is in the diencephalon, and 4 is a more inferior part of the brain between the medulla oblongata and the cerebellum. But there are 4 ventricles. You may have heard of epidural anesthesia. The anesthesiologist would be putting a small amount of anesthetic in that epidural space, which a catheter is left after an injection, and that sometimes we put it in steroids in that space that relieves pain. Okay. So the cerebrum, the main part of the brain, the part that we consider when we think of brain tissue, this is what we think of. And the cerebrum, as the video said, controls our movement, voluntary movement. It interprets sensation. It processes thought. This is where we're thinking. This is where our personality and our will come from. And there's a longitudinal fissure, or kind of like crevice or crack, from anterior to posterior. There's a longitudinal fissure, and that separates the right hemisphere from the left hemisphere. And then cutting across transversely, there is a transverse fissure that divides the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So there's 2 main fissures. You have convolutions, and convolutions, I kind of mentioned this before. The brain is not smooth. There are ridges called gyri or gyrus, and grooves called sulci or sulcus. So the brain kind of looks like ridges and grooves. This increases our brain's surface area, so more brain packed into less space. Then we have the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum, if you remember on that transverse picture, it connects the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. So they're not totally divided. Okay, so we have the left and right sides of the brain divided by the longitudinal fissure. And then we have regions or lobes. And sulci, sulcus, we have a central sulcus here. And here is a good picture of the different lobes of the cerebrum. Okay. In addition to the lobes, we also have areas of the brain that are primarily concerned with motor or movement. Broca's area, we'll talk about in a second, association area, more tissue that's sensory and not motor. Wernicke's area, we have what we call areas that have specialized functions. Okay, so let's back up and talk about the lobes of the brain. And basically the lobes are named for what you can consider the bones of the skull to be named after the lobes of the brain. So where that is what we call it. So we have the frontal lobe, this in blue, and that is underneath the frontal bone. And it's separated from the rest of the brain by the central sulcus. So that groove there is separating it. It has primary and premotor areas. So some movement, Broca's area, which we'll talk about in a second. So it's responsible for movement and conscious thought and speech. So damage to the brain in the frontal lobe might cause damage to speech. Within that frontal lobe, I mentioned, is the primary motor cortex and the premotor cortex. And basically, this has to do with voluntary movement. And there are areas, kind of the strips of the brain, that specifically correspond to moving the knee, the hip, the trunk, along the motor cortex. are the different areas of the body that can be moved by this part of the brain. It's kind of cool. So there's another kind of picture of the primary motor cortex and the part of the brain that has to do with the movement of the body. The next lobe, so we had the frontal lobe separated by the central sulcus. Now we have the parietal lobe, so slightly posterior to the frontal lobe. And it is involved with body sense, perception, where I am in space, language and comprehension, and higher level reasoning. The occipital, the back lobe of the brain, it's posterior to the parietal, and it's responsible for vision. So if you get an injury in the back of your head, that might affect your vision. Your temporal lobes are located kind of where you think of your the temples on your head, on the sides. They're inferior lobes, and they're separated by lateral sulci. The temporal lobes have to do with hearing and the integration of emotions. So hearing and emotions on the sides, vision on the back, motor in the front, and conscious thought. So we have some gyrus, anterior and posterior. We have Broca's area. I mentioned that when I talked about the frontal lobe. And what Broca's area is responsible for is motor output for speech. So Broca area has to do with speech. Wernicke's area is kind of where the parietal and temporal meet. And that has to do with some interpreting information and language. It integrates sensory information coming in from the cerebral cortex. The insula is a section of the brain deeper inside of the temporal lobes. So you have the temporal lobes on the side, and then which are superficial to the insula. That is deeper. It's also sometimes called a fifth lobe, but you cannot label it from the visible exterior surface of the cerebrum. Not much, this is the mysterious lobe, but not much is known about it. So I mentioned before that the corpus callosum connects the right and left hemispheres. Okay, also the fornix and the anterior commissure connect that right and left hemisphere. There's some white matter there filled with myelin, and they surround the lateral ventricles. We've got lots of nuclei in the center of the brain where the corpus callosum is that have to do with motor coordination and sensation and motor control. Now, when we say right brain and left brain, we're talking about the hemispheres, and the brain is contralateral. So the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. Okay, mentioned in the video, we have the diencephalon, which is, again, inside the cerebrum, inferior to the cerebrum, not visible from the outside. And we've got the thalamus, which is kind of the switching station for sensory messages. We have the hypothalamus, which is a gland, really very important gland, responsible for homeostasis. The pineal gland, we'll talk about in the endocrine system, produces melatonin. The pituitary gland, and most of the diencephalon really has to do with the endocrine system. Okay, so inside the diencephalon, we have the third ventricle. We've got some basal nuclei, and we have something called the limbic system. Those nuclei I mentioned, or islands of gray matter, control hormone levels, thirst and hunger, body temperature, sleep and wake cycles, and coordinate the flow of information around the brain. So deep inside those nuclei, those islands are very important. Okay, I just mentioned the limbic system. So what is that? That is, again, a series of deep nuclei or islands of gray matter inside the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and right above or superior to the brainstem. This has to do with mood, emotion, and memory. So mood and emotion are really regulated by a part of the limbic system called the amygdala, okay? And memory is the hippocampus. We have one nucleus that attaches emotion to movement. Another one coordinates emotion with our sense of smell. So if you've ever walked into someone's house and they're cooking something and it brings you back to a memory, that has to do, your limbic system is being activated. Okay. And another nuclei has to do with storing and receiving information. Okay. Lastly, the brainstem, the stalk-like structure, I shouldn't say lastly, we have to talk about the cerebellum, is stalk-like structure, and it's inferior and it's covered up mostly by that cerebrum. But very, very, very important. So we have the thalamus, which we mentioned was a switching station for sensory input. We've got the medulla oblongata, and that's kind of part of and continuous with the spinal cord. And that is responsible for heartbeat, respiration, blood vessel diameter, and emetic center or vomiting center. So that is really important. The medulla oblongata, you won't live long with damage to that. The pons is the next part up. That has to do with respiration and motor tracts for the cerebellum. So again, respiration, that's vital life. The midbrain, it has kind of 4 bulges that has to do with visual and auditory. And lastly, the reticular formation. The reticular formation has to do with our sleep and wake cycles. It's what helps us regulate our sleep and wake cycles. This reticular formation, kind of interesting, is a diffuse network of nuclei in the brainstem. So nuclei, remember, were patches of gray matter. So it's in the brainstem, and it has to do with waking up the cerebral cortex. We're messing with the reticular system when we give general anesthesia. So it's, are we conscious, so have a conscious awareness of our surroundings or not? Sometimes that can be injured through ischemia or blood loss, death, tissue death, trauma, drugs. Any damage to the reticular system leads to coma. So that's a very, very, very important part of the brain stem. In the back, the last section of the brain is called the cerebellum, and that's posterior to the cerebrum. It has hemispheres, right and left, and the connecting ridge is called the vermis. So it's similar in that it's not a smooth organ like the cerebrum. It's got convolutions. Sometimes we refer to it as the little brain because it's almost like a little version of the cerebrum. It has to do with sensory, motor coordination, and most importantly, balance. Damage to the cerebellum damages balance. So inside the cerebellum, we have something called the arbor vitae. And you can see it here, the white. It's gray matter with a white tree of life. And that tree of life is called the arbor vitae. Cerebellum has nuclei in it, coordinating motor sensory. The cerebellum helps fine-tune voluntary skeletal muscle activity. So it enables us to, like in the video you saw, dancing, ballet, balance and posture and coordination and reflexive memory all has to do in the cerebellum. So very, very important for balance, posture, coordination. The cerebellum gets information about planned movement and an actual movement and compares what I think I'm gonna do to what I'm actually doing. And the cerebellum can adjust for that plan. So what I think I'm going to spin around on one foot, and then what I'm actually doing, the cerebellum adjusts for that if there's a mismatch. Then we have some subcortical structures that we mentioned a lot of times, the nuclei. Those are areas of gray matter surrounded by white matter. Those are the islands deep inside the cerebrum. We have basal nuclei, which coordinates the motor system. We have the limbic system, which handles emotion or mood. And then we have the thalamus, the basal nuclei, and the cerebellum being all part of a very complicated motor coordination loop. So without the thalamus, the basal nuclei, and the cerebellum, a lot of our voluntary planned movements and coordination wouldn't be possible. Okay, we mentioned that the CNS is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The spinal cord runs from the foramen magnum into the second lumbar vertebrae. So it goes all the way from the top at the foramen magnum in the skull down to the second lumbar vertebrae. And this is a very, very, very sophisticated superhighway of information. Where it ends at second lumbar or L2 is a pointed structure called the conus medullaris. We have, as you know, we have sections of the spinal column, the vertebra that we have named. We have similar names and sections for the spinal cord. The cervical spinal nerves are C1 through C8. And remember, we had 7 protective vertebrae. You have thoracic spinal nerves. You have lumbar spinal nerves and sacral spinal nerves, S1 through S5. But the actual spinal cord itself ends at L2, the conus medullaris. So we have ascending tracks or pathways. Ascending meaning it's coming in, or afferent, it's sensory information. The peripheral nervous system is telling the spinal cord something is hot, something is painful, something is biting me, and it's going to go ascending in from the spinal nerves up to the brain, ascending up. The descending pathways are what enables us to move our hand away from the stove, or and allows the motor neurons to take over. Nerve roots. So the vertebrae, remember, was an irregular bone. Well, now we're going to look at that a little more carefully. You have the ventral root and the dorsal root. Dorsal means back, right, or posterior. So towards the back of the body is the dorsal root, and towards the front of the body is the ventral root. So that's pretty easy to remember. The ventral root has to do with motor function, whereas the dorsal root in the back side of the nerve root, this dorsal root, has to do with sensory. Spinal nerves are all mixed. We have sensory and motor. We have both. We have input and output. We have afferent and efferent. We have a dorsal root and a ventral root, like I just mentioned, back and front, right? And the white matter and the gray matter are reversed. So whereas the myelinated white was in the inside of the brain, now the myelinated white is on the outside of the spinal column. And there's a butterfly-shaped gray matter on the inside. And if you remember, that contains the cell bodies. And here's another picture of C1 through C8, T1 through T12, lumbar nerves, sacral nerves, coxal nerve, okay? That last little section after the conus medullaris, where the spinal cord exactly ends, the part underneath that is called coda equina, or the horse's tail. So where the spinal cord ends and we have nerves is called coda equina, or the horse's tail. Okay, so looking at a transverse cut of the spinal cord, you've got the anterior medial fissure. So anterior medial fissure is kind of in the front. We have the posterior is in the back, is the fissure. And we have white matter columns or myelinated axons. The white is always myelinated. The gray are the cell bodies. So you have, we call them horns, parts of the spinal cord. The dorsal horns, remember, toward the back, are responsible for sensory. The anterior or ventral are responsible for motor. Lateral horns are dealing with autonomic functions. The horns are where the neuron cell bodies reside. And so the cell, the gray matter we have here, and then the myelin of the axons are out here in the white matter, okay? So the white matter also have, we call them columns rather than horns. Columns, the dorsal ones are in the back, the lateral ones are in the side, and the anterior ones are in the front. So anterior and ventral root in the front, okay? Some other parts of the spinal cord, we have the commissures, which are gray and white and connect the right and left sides of the cord so that the CNS can communicate. We have the central canal in the center, which is a cavity, it's an opening, and it has cerebral spinal fluid in it. We have spinal roots. Remember, we have the dorsal root. Dorsal ganglion is just a collection. And the dorsal in the back is responsible for sensory, whereas the ventral is responsible for motor. Okay. So here's another cross section of ventral and dorsal, posterior and anterior. Spinal nerves, and this is the cross section. Okay, so just like the muscle fibers, nerve fibers have similar coverings and layers. The endoneurium covers the individual nerve fiber itself. Then we have a fascicle, very similar to a muscle fascicle. And the perineurium surrounds that. And the epineurium, very similar to the epimysium, covers the outer layer of the entire nerve bundle. So we mentioned spinal nerves. Spinal nerves, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And they're mixed nerves. Cranial nerves, as mentioned in the video, are a little bit different. Cranial nerves connect the brain to the outside world. We kind of call them brain nerves. They tend to deal with head and neck only. The vagus nerve is the exception. It does do have some action with lower than the upper body. So there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves. All but 2 are out of the brain stem. Cranial nerves are not mixed. They're either sensory or they're motor. Some are mixed, but some are sensory, some are motor, and some are mixed. So they're not all mixed nerves like spinal nerves. They're very, very, very specialized, more so than the spinal nerves. They're not just input and output. And it has to do with the head, the face, and the neck, as well as our sensory systems. So the brain and the cranial nerves give us a good indication of nervous system health, and they represent major controls. So the brain acts as kind of a main processor and director, and the cranial nerves leave the brain, go mainly into the head, bring back sensory information, and then the brain sends back motor instructions. Okay, move this way. And these are the function of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So number 1, olfactory, 2, optic is vision, and so on and so forth. When you have to learn the cranial nerves, this is a good mnemonic. On old Olympus, towering top, a Finn and German viewed a hop. I know that sounds really weird, but it helps you remember the names and the functions for each of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And in some healthcare professions, you will need to know those cranial nerves in order to do a neurologic assessment. And here's a little song about that.
Cranial nerves emerge directly from the brain, unlike spinal nerves in the spinal cord's domain. The first 2 cranial nerves arise from the cerebrum, while the other 10 nerves arise from the brainstem. Your special senses are olfaction, audition, vision, balance, gustation, detected by specialized organs, which collect this information. Your general senses are temperature, vibration, pressure, touch, and pain, detected over a wide spread area and sent to your brain. Cranial nerve 1, the olfactory, helps you detect smells, transmitting signals that come from olfactory epithelium cells. The second, the optic nerve, transmits retinal input. This nerve allows you to see, so here it is, come look. Pupils are constricted by the third nerve, the oculomotor, also running for eye muscles. It's the eyeball's main motor. It talks to the Edinger, Westphal, and oculomotor nuclei to help lens accommodation and lift the upper lid of your eye. The fourth, the trochlear nerve, on the trochlear nucleus relies in order to control the superior open muscles of your eyes. The fifth, the trigeminal, the largest of the cranial nerves, controlling mastication muscles for chewing food it serves, and senses temperature, touch, and pain of your scalp, face, meninges, larynx, pharynx, sinuses, and oral and nasal cavities. The sixth, the abducens nerve, on the abducens nucleus relies to innervate the lateral rectus muscles of your eyes. The seventh, the facial nerve, feels touch behind your ear and controls facial expressions like happiness or fear, to transmitting taste from the front 2/3 of the tongue gets devoted and has secretomotor function for all head glands except the parotid. The eighth, the vestibulocochlear. This nerve has two talons, linking the semicircular canals to the vestibular nucleus for balance and sending sound signals from cochlea to cochlear nucleus. So it talks with two nuclei, as you'll remember if you're studious. The ninth, the glossopharyngeal nerve, takes over the parotid gland, transmitting taste from the back third of the tongue so food isn't bland. It gives sensation to your tongue, tonsils, pharynx, and eardrum too. Innervates the stylopharyngeus muscle, measures blood pressure, pHO2. The 10th, the vagus nerve, has so many functions. From thoracic and abdominal organs, it gets visceral sensations. It also gives sensation to your external ear and to your meninges, lower pharynx and larynx here. It innervates palate muscles and the larynx and the pharynx, causes gland secretion in the thorax, abdomen, larynx, pharynx. The 11th, the accessory nerve for motor use is employed, innervating the upper trapezius and sternocleidomastoid. The 12th, the hypoglossal nerve, has motor function solely and innervates extrinsic and intrinsic tongue muscles totally, except for the palatoglossus, which elevates the tongue's back part and is innervated by the vagus nerve that sets it apart.
Okay, that song goes a little more in detail than we need to know for this course, but what would be good to know about the cranial nerves, the main things are generally what the cranial nerves do, what functions they have in the body, the fact that there are 12 pairs, the fact that some are sensory, some are motor, and some are mixed, and that they mostly control the head, face, and upper body. So contrasting the cranial nerves are the spinal nerves, and there are 31 segments of this. They end, remember, at the L2, lumbar 2, at the conus medullaris, where the cauda equina hangs, or the horse's tail. Spinal nerves dangle loosely, and they float in cerebrospinal fluid. They're connected to the spinal cord, and they're named for where they are connected. They, spinal nerves connect the CNS and the PNS. All spinal nerves are mixed, so they do input and output, they do sensory, and they do motor. Some spinal nerves that are coming from the thoracic spinal cord may project directly into the thoracic body wall. They may not branch. If we use the word plexus, we are talking about segments of the spinal cord that branch extensively, kind of sections. So plexus, like the lumbar plexus would be L1 through L5. The sacral plexus would be S1 through X5. It's kind of a grouping of spinal nerves. Okay, so we have the cervical plexus, we have a brachial plexus, we have thoracic plexus, remember that goes right to the thoracic wall, and then lumbar and sacral. And here's a good picture of comparing them. So cranial nerves are connected right, the nerves are connected right to the brain. Spinal nerves, they're connected to the spinal cord. 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The cranial nerves coordinate the head and neck, except for the vagus nerve, whereas spinal nerves coordinate all parts of the body, but mostly below the neck. We number and name the cranial nerves by Roman numerals and their function, whereas spinal nerves are named for their location on the spinal cord. Cranial nerves can be sensory only, can be motor only, or mixed, but spinal nerves are always mixed. Dermatomes, this is a photo of the map of the body surface and where sensory nerves are kind of located in conjunction with the skin. So C5, the spinal nerve C5, would be this dark orange area on the top of the shoulders and arm called dermatomes. Okay, the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic member kind of is automatic. And that system goes into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic is our fight or flight response. Very much when a stimuli happens, like a dog chasing you, we get an adrenaline rush. And what happens in the body is increased blood flow to skeletal muscles so that we can run. Shoulders may round forward. We may sweat, head forward, increased heart rate, decreased blood flow. We're not digesting because we're not wasting energy or blood flow to our intestinal organs because we need them. The emphasis to go to the skeletal muscles so that we can run. Our calves and buttocks tighten. And this is really pushed by norepinephrine, which stimulates the adrenal glands to produce epinephrine. Epinephrine giving us that adrenaline rush. So the sympathetic is fight or flight. The parasympathetic is the opposite. It's the chill side. It's the resting and digesting. So in this, this is responsible for more, we're not being chased by dogs every day. This is more of the everyday activities. It also calms and reverses that fight or flight or sympathetic effects. So the parasympathetic decreases heart rate, decreases respiration, decreases blood pressure. It may increase digestive activity, including stomach and saliva. And the neurotransmitter acetylcholine has to do with the parasympathetic branch. And it is released and causes these things to happen. So here's a nice picture. The sympathetic is the fight or flight, S kind of standing for stress, sympathetic. And the parasympathetic is more peace, the rest and digest. Parasympathetic has to do with the normal body functioning, where sympathetic is that fight or flight. So your central nervous system will send directions to your organs to gear up for action either in the autonomic system. This is all automatic. It is all involuntary. So if you're having a fight or flight, your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respirations increase, you begin to sweat, blood gets to the skeletal muscles, and you get ready to hit or run. Okay, it's involuntary, you can't control it. Let's see, and here's a nice graphic of kind of what happens, and they're polar opposites. Pupils may dilate in a fight or flight response so that you can let more light in, so you can see what you're doing, whereas they might constrict in the parasympathetic. Heart rate increases, decreases, airways constrict or dilate. You may sweat, blood vessels may have different activities, as well as the digestive system may get stimulated in the parasympathetic, but decrease in the sympathetic. And even the uterus and the urinary system has reactions. So if a large dog bounds at you and starts barking and snarling, your sensory input says, I see a large unfriendly dog, I look at the distance to my car, my lack of immediate help, and that sensory information, what I'm taking in from my ears and my eyes, goes from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, and I got to make a decision. I'm in danger, something needs to be done. Okay, how neurons work. So neurons are excitable cells. They carry an input They carry an electrical charge. And as you can see in this photograph, from the cell body, the dendrites, it goes positive to negative down to the axon terminals. Cells are like miniature batteries. And we're going to talk about the positive and negative flow of ions, which polarizes and changes the electrical charge so that particles can go, the message can go down the axon. Okay, I like those. So that's kind of the movement down the axon. So what we talk about with an electrical impulse is an action potential, and it will travel from the cell body to the axon. Myelin, made by oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system or Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system, make the myelin. And remember, myelin looks white and unmyelinated axons look gray. So this is how an action potential works. An action potential is another word for nerve impulse, and it's all or nothing. So normally our nerves are at what we call a resting potential, and that's negative 70 millivolts. When we are at our resting potential, the cell is at rest, and we have a negative 70 charge. And what you can see in this animation is a resting nerve fiber, a message arrives, and there's a shift of positive into the cell. So negative moves out, and positive moves in. When a cell is stimulated, sodium gates open in the cell membrane, and sodium goes from the cytoplasm across the cell membrane into the cell. And what we call that is when we go from negative 70 millivolts resting, we call that depolarization. So sodium, which is positively charged, makes the cell more positive by flowing into the cell. When sodium enters, if the cell becomes more and more and more positive feedback loop depolarized, okay, until it hits a threshold. When it hits the threshold, the top of this action potential, the sodium gates will close, the positive potassium will start to leave, and the cell becomes more and more negative. And this is a negative feedback loop. So resting membrane, negative 70. We've got more negative on the outside and more positive on the inside. Okay. Then there's a stimulus, like a bug bite. And the stimulus causes the sodium, the positive, to rush into the cell, making it more positive. And that's called depolarization, making it more and more and more positive, and a loss of that negative charge. And then when it hits that threshold of depolarizing, we get the action potential, and then the sodium channels start to close, the potassium start to open again, and negative charge is restored. And sometimes that negative charge gets restored so much that it kind of overshoots, and we get hyperpolarization, which is lower. But it will come back up to that negative 70 resting potential. So hyperpolarization, here we go. Negative 70, we're resting, we get bit by something. Then we have the sodium channels open, more positive comes in, and we hit that threshold of negative 55, and that causes this depolarization, repolarization. Okay. Then if we overshoot, if more negative, it becomes really negative, we get this hyperpolarization period. And then the time between that hyperpolarization and coming back up to that beautiful negative 70 millivolts is called the refractory period. And no more stimulus can affect the cell during that time. Until we're back up to negative 70, we cannot have another action potential. Potentials can be graded. So the size of the stimulus equals the size of the excitement. They can be decremental, where it decreases with distance. It can be reversible. It can be excitatory or inhibitory. But action potentials are usually all or none, meaning that depolarization always finishes and typically is the same size and it returns back. Here's a little video explaining this.
Neurons communicate with each other through their dendrites and axon. Generally, incoming signals are received at dendrites, while outgoing signals travel along the axon to the nerve terminal. In order to achieve rapid communication over its long axon, the neuron sends electrical signals from the cell's body to the nerve terminal along the axon. These are known as nerve impulses, or action potentials. An action potential is essentially a brief reversal of electric polarity across the cell membrane. Cells are polarized, meaning there is an electrical voltage across the cell membrane. In a resting neuron, the typical voltage, known as the resting membrane potential, is about negative 70 millivolts. The negative value means the cell is more negative on the inside. At this resting state, there are concentration gradients of sodium and potassium across the cell membrane. More sodium outside the cell and more potassium inside the cell. These gradients are maintained by the sodium-potassium pump, which constantly brings potassium in and pumps sodium out of the cell. A neuron is typically stimulated at dendrites, and the signal spread through the soma. Excitatory signals at dendrites open ligand-gated sodium channels and allow sodium to flow into the cell. This neutralizes some of the negative charge inside the cell and makes the membrane voltage less negative. This is known as depolarization, as the cell membrane becomes less polarized. The influx of sodium diffuses inside the neuron and produces a current that travels towards the axon hillock. If the summation of all input signals is excitatory and is strong enough when it reaches the axon hillock, an action potential is generated and travels down the axon to the nerve terminal. The axon hillock is also known as the cell's trigger zone, as this is where action potentials usually start. This is because action potentials are produced by voltage-gated ion channels that are most concentrated at the axon hillock. Voltage-gated ion channels are passageways for ions in and out of the cell, and as their name suggests, are regulated by membrane voltage. They open at some values of the membrane potential and close at others. For an action potential to be generated, the signal must be strong enough to bring the membrane voltage to a critical value called the threshold, typically about negative 55 millivolts. This is the minimum required to open voltage-gated ion channels. At threshold, sodium channels open quickly. Potassium channels also open, but do so more slowly. The initial effect is therefore due to sodium influx. As sodium ions rush into the cell, the inside of the cell becomes more positive, and this further depolarizes the cell membrane. The increasing voltage in turn causes even more sodium channels to open. This positive feedback continues until all the sodium channels are open and corresponds to the rising phase of the action potential. Note that the polarity across the cell membrane is now reversed. As the action potential nears its peak, sodium channels begin to close. By this time, the slow potassium channels are fully open. Potassium ions rush out of the cell, and the voltage quickly returns to its original resting value. This corresponds to the falling phase of the action potential. Note that sodium and potassium have now switched places across the membrane. As the potassium gates are also slow to close, potassium continues to leave the cell a little longer, resulting in a negative overshoot called hyperpolarization. The resting membrane potential is then slowly restored thanks to diffusion and the sodium-potassium pump. During and shortly after an action potential is generated, it is impossible or very difficult to stimulate that part of the membrane to fire again. This is known as the refractory period. The refractory period is divided into absolute refractory and relative refractory. The absolute refractory period lasts from the start of an action potential to the point the voltage first returns to the resting membrane value. During this time, the sodium channels are open and subsequently inactivated while closing and thus unable to respond to any new stimulation. The relative refractory period lasts until the end of hyperpolarization. During this time, some of the potassium channels are still open, making it difficult for the membrane to depolarize, and a much stronger signal is required to induce a new response. During an action potential, the sodium influx at a point on the axon spreads along the axon, depolarizing the adjacent patch of the membrane, generating a similar action potential in it. The sodium currents diffuse in both directions on the axon, but the refractory properties of ion channels ensure that action potential propagates only in one direction. This is because only the unfired patch of the axon can respond with an action potential. The part that has just fired is unresponsive until the action potential is safely out of range. An action potential generated at the axon hillock usually travels down the axon to the nerve terminal and not back to the cell body. This is because the concentrations of voltage-gated ion channels are higher in the axon than in the cell body.
Okay, I thought that visual was pretty helpful. So you saw the action potential will move down the body of the axon. And that has to do, the speed of this has to do with the amount of myelin. The amount of myelin helps move it along. And the jumping from myelin, from nodes of Ranvier to node of Ranvier, is called salutary conduction. That's jumping. So actually, I had it reversed. The unmyelinated, think about fat slowing you down. The unmyelinated, from node to node, that is quicker down an unmyelinated neuron. Okay, so it only goes down on the unmyelinated part of the axon, and also the wider the diameter of the axon, then the faster the message or the axon potential moves down. So it's almost like a person skipping. So skipping from node to node to node to node. The more unmyelinated, the faster. Okay. So unmyelinated, it can move faster. Myelinated, it has to skip node to node. Reflexes are the simplest form of motor output. So generally they're protective, they're involuntary. Some familiar ones are withdrawal, vestibular, and startle reflexes. So the brain often is not even involved. It's just the input, peripheral nerves come to the spinal cord, and then our brain, our reflexes tell us to move. So that it doesn't even hit the brain. It doesn't even go up the ascending tract. It's all within the spinal cord, our reflexes. And here's an example of a reflex arc. So we touch something, the dendrites receive the stimulus, the afferent or sensory or input comes to the central nervous system as an action potential. Okay, so it comes to the spinal cord. The brain or spinal cord, in the example of a reflex, it would just be the spinal cord, conducts the signal from a sensory neuron to a motor neuron. That motor or efferent, output one, carries the action potential away from the CNS toward the PNS, and the effector, the signal strikes a structure, causing our skeletal muscle to, or our smooth muscle to react, like as moving the hand back. Okay. So to summarize, we have the nervous system divided into the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral. The peripheral provides sensory information to the central nervous system, and the central nervous system gives motor messages to the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is divided into the somatic or skeletal muscles and the autonomic, which is automatic, smooth, and cardiac muscle. That autonomic nervous system is divided into parasympathetic, having to do with rest and digest or homeostasis, daily, everyday activities, or the sympathetic that has to do with fight or flight. We're having some slow internet here. We're just going to skip forward here. Okay. The rest of the slides for this are not necessary for our purposes. There are some slides that cover some diagnostic testing and pathophysiology. You can access them. They're a little bit grayed out. But that is enough, and there's a lot for you to digest there with the nervous system. So the second part will be about the nervous system, but with regards to the sensory system.